Hey guys, it's Courtney, and I am very excited to introduce you to a very new stamp company, brand new stamp company called Scrappy Tales. And this is the brainchild of Sabrina, who is a designer and a creator. And I'll link all of her information below because she's super talented. And now she's even expanding her talents and creating stamp sets. So I am going to be creating a one-layer scene using the German Winter Village stamp set. And you can see that I have all of my masks pre-cut. I used Simon's stamp masking paper, and I'm working on a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. And all I really did to kind of get started is to arrange my masks in place where I'm going to actually stamp my images. Then I can begin stamping. And when you're creating a one-layer scene with a lot of stamping and masking, you want to work front to back. So any images that are in front of another, you will want to stamp and mask first. So I'm just placing this first row or first layer of stamps down. Then I can remove all of these masks, go ahead and stamp these out, and I'm going to be using some blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it's a Copics safe ink. And then I can mask that layer out, or that row of images out, and then move on to the next row. And I think I had a total of like 4 or 5 rows of stamping for this particular scene. And what I had in my mind definitely didn't come out the way I wanted it. And you'll see that I kind of struggled with this card a little bit, but I put too much effort into even fussy cutting these images that I was not about to start over. So I'm moving on to this Christmas tree, and I have this little couple in front of it as if they're kind of just admiring the Christmas tree. Going to mask that out and then move on to the houses. Now, some of the houses, and I didn't use all of them, some of them are facing just straight on, and some of them are kind of off to the side. So I used the ones that are kind of off to the side on either side of the card to make it, to kind of give it a little bit of depth, I guess you could say. So I'm going to start by stamping and masking those first because the other ones are going to naturally be behind it. So I'm stamping all of these twice. These are pretty intricate images. There's a whole lot of detail to these images, which is great for any level of colorist there is. Because there's so much detail, you can pretty much get away with just coloring them solid, just one color, maybe 2 for the larger areas. And for the colorists that want to maybe expand their coloring or that really enjoy adding a whole lot of detail, there is a whole lot of detail to be added to these images. So I really had fun with this stamp set. It was just perfect for any level. So I'm going to move on to the final 2 little houses here, and I couldn't fit them both on side by side just because they were just a little bit too large. So I am going to stamp them one at a time. Now for this church, which unfortunately I didn't measure correctly because I lost the very top of it, but I did have to flip my paper around just so that I could continue to use my MISTI. Being I stamped all of the images twice, I didn't want to just stamp that once with an acrylic block because I wanted an equal outline around each one of the stamps. So just going to finish off with this final image here, and then I will mask that out, and we're going to work on the background, which I am going to be doing some ink blending for my background. You can certainly use Copics, watercolor, whatever you want to use. I just found that distress inks were the easiest for me to do, and I'm using regular distress ink, not distress oxide. So I'm taking another piece of that masking paper here, and I'm just going to cut a wavy line. Doesn't have to be perfect, but I am going to use both pieces, so keep both pieces. First, I am going to mask out the top portion of my card panel. I'm going to just work on the ground, so the snowy area. And I'm going to be using just 2 colors, tumbled glass and shaded lilac. So for the bluish color, the tumbled glass, that's going to be towards the top. And you can see, well, I don't know whether you can see because it doesn't look like I'm putting any ink down at all. 2 reasons for that. Number 1, I'm going with a very, very light hand because I want this to be very light. Well, there's three reasons, I guess. The second reason is it's distress ink, not distress oxides. And if you go in with too heavy of a hand, you're going to end up getting those brush lines or the ink blending tool lines, and you don't want that. And number three, my ink pads are dry. So I'm going to, once I have a little bit of a light layer down, I'm going to basically just cut a little blob out of some more masking paper. And this is going to be my little pond, I guess you could say, that these ice skaters are skating on. Doesn't, again, have to be perfect. I just want to have that shape of this little ice skating rink or pond or whatever you want to call it. And I'm just going to plop that right down and then continue on to my ink blending for the snow. And again, I'm just going to stick to these two colors. I'm going to be adding Copic markers to over this, which is another reason why I use distress ink and not distress oxides. So I'll add a little bit of something to that pond. I tried anyway. So I'm going to add a little bit of that shaded lilac coming up from the bottom of the card panel and also around that little pond area, just to add a little bit of a shadow there to kind of differentiate between that and the snow. And then I can kind of just blend those two colors together. These colors actually blend really nicely together. You're going to get a very soft look, especially if you're using regular distress inks. The distress oxides tend to give you a little bit more of a bolder look with this particular color combination. But it's hard to tell that I have any color on at all, but once I remove the mask, you'll really be able to tell. So once I was happy with the snowy area, we can move on to the sky. And this is where we're going to be using that negative piece of that curvy line that we cut from that masking paper. So I'm going to carefully remove the mask that I have on the top, and then I'm just going to line that up. Now, when you line this up, you want to see just a little bit of that bottom showing. So a little bit of that tumbled glass, you just want that to be peeking through, because the paper, the masking paper, as thin as it is, raises up a little bit. So you want to be able to get right against that paper, or else you're going to have a little bit of a white outline. So in order to avoid that, I just like to have a little bit of that peeking through. So I'm going to move on to Dusty Concord, Faded Jeans, and Chipped Sapphire. And these are obviously very dark colors. This is going to be a nighttime scene. And this is where I get a little bit nervous with distress inks. I guess I got a little bit too comfortable with the oxides blending so seamlessly that I was too afraid that I was going to make some of those blobby marks that you cannot get up with distress inks. You can get them up with distress oxides because the oxides sit on top of the paper, where these kind of soak right in right away. So I started with the purple right against that mask, and then I'm going to move on to the Chipped Sapphire right on the top. You can see I am going in with a very light hand. I don't have a whole lot of ink down on the paper. I'm gradually building up my color. Then I can use that Faded Jeans right there in the center to kind of get the Chipped Sapphire and the Dusty Concord to begin blending. And once I feel like I have a pretty good blend and I have the paper a little bit saturated, then I can go in with a little bit heavier of a hand. I have a good base of color down. So now I'm probably going to avoid getting those brush lines that we sometimes get. So I'm going to go in with a heavy hand now, again, starting with that Chipped Sapphire, working from top to bottom this time, and really going in deep with that dark blue. Then I'll move on to the Faded Jeans and blend that down a little bit further. And then again, finish off with that Dusty Concord right against that bottom mask. Now, of course, this is a nighttime scene, but it's also a winter scene, and we have a winter village, ice skaters and snowy roofs, and so I want to have snow in the background. So a couple ways you can do this. Easiest way for me, and probably something we all have in our craft room, is just using some acrylic paint. So I'm going to take a little bit of white acrylic paint and squirt that onto just an acrylic block. You can use a palette or whatever you have. And I'm going to take a paintbrush and I'm just going to water this down just a little bit. You don't want it too watery. You just want it watery enough where you can actually spatter it. So I just added 2 or 3 drops of water, swirled that around, and you just want to make sure that your paintbrush is not too clumpy. If you have it too clumpy, you're going to get a big old blob of paint on your background. So you just want to pick up just a little bit and spatter a little bit at a time. Now I did let this sit for about 15 minutes or so to make sure that not only the ink was dry, but so was this paint before I remove my masks. You want to make sure that everything is completely dry, or else you're going to risk tearing your paper once you remove those masks. You may want to use the tip of your scissors or a craft knife to kind of get you started so that they're a little bit easier to remove. So just carefully removing those. Don't try to save your masks. If they tear, let them tear. Just don't tear your paper. So we're going to move on to the Copic coloring, and you're going to see me struggle with this a lot. I'm going to start off with my little pond here. And I'm going to go back and forth to this several times throughout the video because I just wasn't happy with it. I'm starting off with just the tip of my marker using some very light colors. I'm using a B60, a B00, and a BG11, I believe. And I'm just going to add a little bit of shine and texture, not texture, I guess, more shine to the ice. And I wasn't liking it. I guess it was too light. It is a nighttime scene, so it wouldn't necessarily be this light and bright, but I kind of continued with it to kind of see what it would turn into. And I decided to take a C marker and go over the entire thing. Not only is this going to kind of blend those flick lines out, but I thought it would add just a little bit of a hint of gray to it to make it look like it was ice. So I used a C00, which is really super light. It's almost a colorless blender with just a tad bit of gray to it. It's basically a colorless blender. And I went over the entire thing. And while it did tone down the flick lines, it really just was not looking like a frozen pond at all. So I kind of thought about it and figured, let me color the rest of the images and I'll go back to it to kind of see how it's all coming together. So I moved on from that and I'm going to color the little houses, but I'm not going to show you all of them because I colored them very similar. I just used different color combinations. For the most part, I'm using E markers, the earth tone markers, browns and reddish browns, and even some warm grays. And I kind of just mix them up. I'm not doing a lot of contrast. Well, I can't say I'm not doing a whole lot of contrast. I'm not using a whole lot of colors for each part of the images because there's so much detail to these images that you really don't have to. You could probably get away with using 2 color blends for pretty much everything. I used 3 for the most part, and in certain areas where, it was very small, I may have only used 2, and in other cases, I may have only used 1. So it all depends on your comfort level. You don't want your colors to bleed too much because once it bleeds onto your ink blended background, especially if it's a darker color, you're gonna have a really hard time either covering it up or moving it back with a colorless blender to where it needs to go. So you're better off just kind of sticking to what you're comfortable with. So I'm using kind of some brick colors, I guess you could say, for some of these areas. And this particular house, I didn't get quite enough contrast, so I ended up going in with the E18, which is actually darker than the E19, which doesn't really make too much sense. But the E18 is a little bit more brown, where the E19 is a little bit more of a reddish tone. They're both reddish tones, but the E19 is much more red than the E18. So just keep that in mind if you're purchasing Copic markers or adding to your collection. E19 is lighter than E18. So next I'm going to go in with a E30 combination, and you can see where the house is kind of, where you can see the corner of the house. I am making sure that I don't have 2 of the darkest areas or 2 of the lightest areas directly next to one another, just because you want some differentiation there. If you have 2 dark areas directly next to each other or 2 light areas, you're not really going to be able to get the shape of the house. It's just going to look kind of flat. And I don't want that. So it doesn't matter where you put your shadows really, because I'm not really worried about a light source, just as long as those 2 dark areas or 2 light areas are not directly next to one another. I wasn't really getting a great blend here, so I ended up having to go back in with the E35 and flick that color out just a little bit further. The E37 and E35, for some reason, I feel like it's a big jump. It doesn't look like it, but sometimes I have a hard time blending those two. For whatever reason, it's probably just me. Now, for the windows, I am going to color those in just yellow. And I did this for all of them with the exception of the church, which I'll show you in just a minute, just because I want the lights to look like they're on, and I'm not worried about the window frames. The window frames, the little door frames and things like that, I'm not coloring those in with Copic markers. They are teeny, 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 tiny, and I'm not risking it. So you'll see what I do later on to fix those areas up, but for now, I am just totally skipping them. Now for the little church, I wanted these to look like they had stained glass windows. There we go. So I'm taking a yellow, a red, and an orange, and I'm just adding little dots. So I started with the yellow. I'm going to add little dots with the orange and add little dots with the red. And then I'm going to go back to that yellow and kind of just go over the entire thing. It didn't add too much. I guess if you look carefully, it kind of looks like stained glass, but I just wanted it to look a little bit different than the rest of the houses. So I went ahead and colored in the other two houses, very similar to the first two. So I'm not going to bother to show you those. And then we are going to move on to the people, or at least some of the people. I'm not going to color their clothes yet, but I did go in for their skin tones and their hair. For their little outfits and coats and jackets and things, it's going to be reds, and I'm going to save that for last until I'm actually happy with my little frozen pond. So I did use different skin tones. I kept to all E15s, E13s, all of that, but I did color them just a little bit different. And for their hair, I colored those a little bit different, but again, didn't bring out a whole lot of markers. You could probably get away with coloring a huge scene like this with very few markers. It depends on the amount that you use them. So keep in mind that when I go in with my scary dark and I use just a teeny tiny bit of it, for the next image, I could use even more of it and it will look totally different even though I'm using the same color combination. So just keep that in mind when you're going to purchase your markers or whatever markers you're using. You don't need all of them because you can work with what you have and come up with different combinations. So once their hair was done, I'm just finishing up these last two here. I'm going to use the same color combination. Again, I am just going to use a different amount for each one. And that way they have the same color hair, but obviously the mom here has a little bit more hair showing. So I'm going to bring in a third color for her hair. And I'm just going to add a little bit of shading where she has her ponytail. So her hair would be gathered there in her ponytail, and that would naturally be a little bit darker than the rest. Now for this guy over here standing in front of the Christmas tree, I want to make him a blonde. So blondes are not yellow. So it's okay to use a yellow, but you want to have some kind of darker color in there. So I'm using an E99, a Y26, and a Y23. Again, not a huge area to work with, so you don't have to do too much shading there. So next I am going to go in for the Christmas tree, and I'm going to be using a green combination naturally, and I am just starting off with my darkest color because I wanted to keep a little bit of texture within here, some flick lines. It didn't really work out, but a lot of things didn't work out for me for this card, but I wanted to keep that texture in there. So I do like to start off with my darkest color when I do that. And I'm just adding a little bit of shading under each one of the little sections of the tree, and also adding some shading underneath the lights or the ornaments, whatever you want them to be, depending on how you color them. And I used a natural blending family. However, I just didn't get the best blend. I didn't get the best look. And I'm sorry if you guys can hear that. There's like a helicopter going over. So it might be a while. So sorry if you hear that in the background. But again, I am going to fix that in the end along with my little window frames and door frames and things like that. Now I'm going to go back to this frozen pond or ice skating rink, whatever you want to call it. And I figured it just wasn't dark enough. This is the night scene, and the snow is supposed to be white, but the ice wouldn't necessarily be. So I'm going to bring in some B90 markers, and I'm going to add those flick lines just like I did the first time around, but obviously these are a whole lot darker, and I'm just using two of them. I'm using the B97 and B95, and then I am going to cover the entire thing with the B91. And it was just a little bit too blue. I guess it's supposed to be blue, but it was just a little bit too blue. It did kind of tone down the flick lines, but it was just a little bit too much. So I'm going to go over it with a C marker and see how I like that. And it toned it down, it grayed it out a little bit, which I guess looks a little bit more like ice. I still wasn't happy with it though. So I decided to add some shadows to the snow itself around the pond to make it really stand out. So I'm going to bring in some BV markers, which kind of match the shaded lilac distress ink, but I added such little distress ink that it was a little bit darker than I wanted it to be. But I'm basically just outlining the little pond and flicking out that color a little bit on either side. And while I'm at it, I'm also going to add a shadow underneath this couple that is looking at the Christmas tree. Next, I can go down to a lighter color here, and I'm just going to flick that color out a little bit and also extend that shadow underneath those two people. And then finally bringing in the BV00 and flicking that color out even further. I did have some flick lines, and so it didn't totally match the shaded lilac. So in order to get rid of those flick lines, I'm just going to bring in a colorless blender, kind of go over those flick lines very quickly, and that will tone it down and make it look more of like a seamless blend. I guess it looked a little bit better than what it did before. Still didn't like it. So I ended up going over the entire thing once again with a B70 marker, and that kind of matched the shaded lilac a little bit more. So it kind of blended in with the snow a little bit more, I guess you could say. And at this point in the game, it is what it is. I'm not going over this a million times. My colors are going to start bleeding. It's not going to look the way I had it in my mind, and I'm okay with that. So I am going to move on finally to the little outfits and jackets and pants and hats and everything that these little people are wearing. Again, not going to show you all of them, but I am going to show you the color combinations. I'm only using 2 color combinations. So for the reds, it's going to be an R46 and an R43. I'm going right in with the R46 just to add my shadows, which the R46 is more of a true red. The R43 is more of a highlight color. And I'm just going to blend that out very carefully. You don't want your reds to bleed. For the greens, I initially started with a G94 and a G43, but I just didn't feel like I got quite enough contrast. Being I'm only using 2 colors here, I want to make sure that I'm actually getting the contrast I'm looking for. So I ended up using the G99 instead of the G94, and that worked out pretty well. So I used all of the same color combinations for all of the people, and I did bring in some grays for white areas and black areas. Now to fill in the rest of my little window frames and things like that, I'm using some colored pencils. Not doing any shading to these areas. I'm just going to go over with a very sharp pencil just to fill in a little bit of color. And I just kind of mixed those up. Now for this wreath and this greenery, I don't know what you'd call it, on this roof, I'm just going to kind of scribble on some color, some greens, and kind of just let them blend. And that way it'll give it a little bit of dimension and some differentiation between the leaves. Also going to use the same color combination, and I'm going to go over this Christmas tree because I was not happy with the Copic coloring. So all I'm doing is pretty much just coloring it the same way as I did with the Copic markers. I'm just going to do it with my pencils this time and go right over the initial coloring. So I already have that base color. I'm just going to intensify some of those shadow areas. And you can see, well, hopefully you can tell, but I'm going in with a very, very light hand. With the pencils, once you press too hard, you're not going to be able to blend it out too well. So you always want to use a light hand. You can always add more color later on. So for the star and I'm going to say they're lights. On my Christmas tree, they're lights, but they can certainly be ornaments if you prefer. I'm just going to use kind of like this yellowish color. I do have a gold pencil, but it didn't look so well. It kind of looked too brown, and I didn't care for that. So I'm using this yellow. For the rest of the snow, I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to it, the snow on the roof. And I'm just going to, first I took a white pencil and went over some of my coloring mistakes rather than a white gel pen. It's opaque, it will work. So for the snow, I am going to add just a little bit of color with that B00. And again, I'm not too concerned with it blending out to white. because I'm going to use that colorless blender to kind of blend that out to make it more of a seamless blend. And that way I have just a little bit of shading to the snow on the rooftops. So once my coloring was finally complete, and I can go ahead and add my sentiment and add a little bit of sparkle. I'm going to stamp my sentiment right there in the lower left-hand corner. That way it will hide some of my horrible ice skating rink or whatever you want to call it. It will kind of tone it down a little bit. Stamp that with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink and added some shimmer with a Spectrum Noir shimmer pen to just some random areas on the ice. I didn't cover the entire thing. I kind of just plopped down the brush and just kind of scattered it. But that is it. That is the card for today. I will leave all of the supplies, including the new website for Scrappy Tales. Thanks so much for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.